Stand in the old town of Salzburg at dawn, and you hear it before you see it. Church bells, dozens of them, echoing off a fortress that has watched this valley for nearly 1,000 years. Tourists come here for Mozart. They come for the sound of music. Most never learn that this postcard city was built on salt and ruled for 11 centuries by priests who commanded armies, that it once drove 20,000 of its own people over the mountains for their faith, or that the man who started the Second World War kept his mountain home just across the border, close enough to see these peaks from his window. Salzburg looks like a stage set. That is because, for 1,300 years, it has been one, a stage for saints and salt barons, for genius and catastrophe. This is the entire history of Salzburg. It begins with a river, a Roman ruin, and the white gold buried inside the mountains. Chapter 1. White Gold. Long before there was a Salzburg, there was salt. We barely think about salt today. It sits in a shaker on every kitchen table in America and costs about $1 a box. Now take away the refrigerator. Take away the canning factory and the freezer aisle. If you want meat in February, if you want fish that does not rot on the wagon ride to market, you need salt. And you need a lot of it. In the ancient world, salt was not a seasoning. Salt was survival. The Roman word for a soldier's allowance, salarium, is connected to their word for salt, and the old story claims that legionaries were sometimes paid in it. Historians still argue over whether that story is literally true. The economics behind it were true beyond any argument. Whoever controlled salt controlled life itself. It was the oil of the ancient world, and the mountains south of present-day Salzburg were full of it. Millions of years ago, this entire region lay beneath a shallow prehistoric sea. When the water evaporated and the Alps buckled upward, enormous beds of rock salt were folded deep into the mountains, and there they sat, in the dark, waiting for someone clever enough and hungry enough to dig them out. The first people to do it on an industrial scale were the Celts, on a mountain called the Dernberg, above the modern town of Hallein, about 10 miles south of Salzburg. Celtic miners were cutting shafts into the rock more than 2,500 years ago. Hold that number against something familiar. This valley was already running a serious mining operation, roughly 2,000 years before the first English settlers stepped ashore at Jamestown. And the mountain kept the receipts, because salt preserves things. Archaeologists working the Dernberg have pulled out wooden tools, leather-carrying sacks, scraps of the miners' clothing, even preserved human waste, which tells researchers exactly what these people ate for lunch 25 centuries ago. The miners went into the mountain for the salt. The salt kept their entire world for us, and the salt made them rich. Graves excavated around the Dernberg have produced bronze vessels, fine jewellery, and luxury goods imported from as far away as the Mediterranean world. One find, an ornate bronze wine flagon of stunning workmanship, is now ranked among the masterpieces of early Celtic art. Think about what that single object means. 25 centuries ago, this remote alpine valley was already plugged into a trade network reaching across a continent. Salt flowed out. Wealth flowed in. The pattern that would define this place for the next 2,000 years was set before Rome was even an empire. How important was this world of salt? Important enough that it named an entire age. A few valleys east of Salzburg lies the little lakeside town of Hallstatt, another ancient salt mining centre, and when archaeologists in the 1800s uncovered its vast prehistoric cemetery, The finds were so rich that scholars named a whole era of European prehistory after the place, the Hallstatt period. To this day, when a professor in Boston or Berlin lectures on early Iron Age Europe, the name on the screen comes from a salt town in these mountains. The people here were not living on the edge of the ancient world. For a while, they practically defined it. Then Rome arrived, around 15 BC. Roman forces moved into the Alps and folded the local Celtic kingdom, called Noricum, into the empire. Compared with Rome's bloodier conquests, the takeover appears to have been relatively quiet, and historians have long pointed out that Noricum had traded peacefully with Rome for generations before the soldiers came. The Romans knew exactly what they were acquiring: iron, gold. The mountain passes to Italy, and Salt, where the Salzach River bends through the valley floor, beneath a steep rocky hill. The Romans built a town and called it Iuvavum. Under the Emperor Claudius in the 1st century, it was raised to the rank of municipium, a self-governing Roman town with real legal standing. This was no rough frontier camp. Iuvavum had a forum, temples, workshops, baths, and comfortable private homes. Construction crews in modern Salzburg still hit Roman floors when they dig. Beneath the coffee houses there are mosaics, and one of them, uncovered in the old town, shows scenes tied to the Greek legend of Theseus, laid down by some wealthy resident who wanted his floor to tell a hero story in the middle of the Alps. For roughly 4 centuries, Iuvavum lived the comfortable life of a provincial Roman town. Then, like Roman towns all across the Western Empire, it began to die. The 5th century brought the collapse. Borders buckled. Germanic groups pushed south and west. Trade thinned. Administration dissolved. And towns that ran on Roman order simply emptied out. We even have an eyewitness. A churchman named Eugippius wrote a life of Saint Severinus, a mysterious holy man who moved through the crumbling towns of Noricum in the late 400s, organizing food supplies, negotiating with warlords, and evacuating terrified Roman civilians. His account describes abandoned settlements and refugees on the roads. It is the end of the Roman Alps, recorded by a man who watched it happen with his own eyes. Iuvavum faded into ruin. Weeds took the forum. The mosaics vanished under mud and rubble. For about 200 years, the site was little more than broken walls beside a river, with a shrinking population scratching out a living among the stones of a better age. But notice what never changed. The river still flowed north toward the Danube. The passes still linked Italy to the German lands. The salt was still in the mountains. The reason for a city here had not gone anywhere. The place was simply waiting for someone with vision and backing to start again. That someone arrived in the year 696. His name was Rupert. He was a bishop from the Frankish lands, well connected to the ruling families of his day, and by every account a practical, tireless man. The Duke of Bavaria, a ruler named Theodo, wanted Christian missionaries to anchor his territory, and he handed Rupert something extraordinary: the ruins of Iuvavum, the lands around them, and crucially, rights connected to the salt. Rupert walked through a dead town and saw a foundation. On the rock terraces at the foot of the fortress hill, he established a monastery dedicated to St. Peter. That community still exists today, more than 1,300 years later, which makes it one of the oldest continuously operating monasteries in the entire German-speaking world. He also founded a convent on the hill called the Nonnberg, the Nuns' Mountain, and placed his niece Erentrudis in charge of it. 12 centuries later, A restless novice named Maria would live behind those same convent walls, and Hollywood would make her the most famous nun in the world. The road to the sound of music starts here, in the 690s, with a bishop and his niece. Salzburg has never forgotten Rupert. He became the city's patron saint, and every September the old town still fills with one of Austria's great folk festivals held in his honour. Brass bands and traditional dress and long tables under the autumn sky. In the shadow of the cathedral, visitors sometimes assume that sort of thing exists for the tourists. It does not. It exists because a bishop rebuilt a dead town 1,300 years ago, and the town has never stopped being grateful. Rupert's settlement needed workers, so tradition holds that he brought colonists up from Bavaria. It needed money, so he restarted the salt works. Flat boats loaded with white gold began moving down the river again, exactly as they had under the Celts and the Romans before them, and the town that grew around the monastery took its name from the trade that fed it. The Salt Castle, Salzburg. Pay attention to what kind of town this was, because it explains the next 1,000 years. Salzburg was not founded by a king building a capital, or by merchants building a market. It was founded by a churchman on church land, with salt money. From day one, religion and revenue were fused here into a single thing. The men who ran the church would also run the mines, the boats, the tolls, and eventually the government itself. In most of Europe, priests answered to princes. In Salzburg, the priest was about to become the prince. Within a century, the arrangement was formalized, and Salzburg was elevated to an archbishopric with authority over a huge stretch of Central Europe, which leaves us with the question this whole story keeps answering. Century after century, what happens to a city when the men who hear confessions also command the soldiers and count the money? Salzburg spent 1,100 years finding out. Chapter 2. The City of Priests. Every city has a founding story. Salzburg has a founding argument. In the 700s, the young town beside the river attracted an unusual kind of leader. One of the first great figures was a bishop named Virgil, an Irish monk who had crossed half of Europe to end up in the Alps. Virgil was a scholar, and by the standards of his century, a dangerous one. Records of a dispute from that era show that he was accused before the Pope of teaching that people might exist on the far side of the earth, an idea that struck his enemies as close to heresy. His great rival, the famous missionary Boniface, wanted him condemned for it. Virgil survived the accusation, kept his career, and went on to raise the first cathedral of Salzburg, a church of remarkable size for its age. Centuries later, the church would formally declare this same man a saint. So the first monumental building in this city was built by a man once accused of dangerous ideas about the shape of the world, who ended up canonized anyway. Salzburg has been mixing faith, ambition, and controversy from the very start, and there is a coda to Virgil's story. Centuries after his death, during later construction at the cathedral, remains identified as his were rediscovered beneath the church he had built, and in 1233 the Pope formally declared him a saint. The man once accused of heresy about the far side of the earth is now one of Salzburg's patron saints. This city has a habit of arguing with its greatest people first and celebrating them later. Watch for that pattern. It repeats. Then came the promotion that changed everything. In 798, at the urging of Charlemagne, the Pope elevated Salzburg to an archbishopric. On paper, it was a church decision. In practice, it was a power grant. The Archbishop of Salzburg now outranked the bishops across a vast stretch of Central Europe, with authority reaching deep into what is now Austria, Bavaria, and beyond. And his missionaries pushed the frontier of Christianity eastward into lands no Roman map had ever named. The first man to hold the new title, an efficient churchman named Arno, was a personal associate of Charlemagne himself. From this point forward, whoever ruled Salzburg was not just a priest, he was a player in imperial politics. You can measure the new status in ink. Salzburg in these centuries grew into one of the important manuscript centres north of the Alps, its monastery workshops copying and illuminating books at a time when a single volume represented months of labour and a small fortune in materials. And you can measure it in miles. Salzburg missionaries carried Christianity east and south into Alpine and Slavic lands, the old Roman maps barely named, planting churches that answered, in the end, to the man beside the Salzach. A town that had been a ruin barely a century earlier was now exporting faith, books, and authority across half of Central Europe, and imperial politics. In the Middle Ages, was a blood sport. The town learned that in the 900s, when Hungarian horsemen swept through the region during their great raids across Europe, the valley was open, the town was rich, and wealth without walls is an invitation. Salzburg endured the raids, rebuilt, and carried on, but the lessons sank in deep. A rich city needs stone. That lesson was about to produce the most famous silhouette in Austria, because, in the 1070s, the two most powerful men in the Western world went to war with each other, and Salzburg stood directly in the crossfire. On one side, Pope Gregory VII, a reformer with an iron will, insisting that only the Church could appoint bishops. On the other, Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, who regarded bishops as his own political appointees, because bishops in his empire controlled land, money, and soldiers. Historians call this fight the investiture controversy, which sounds like paperwork. Strip away the Latin, and it is a raw question that never really goes away. Who is actually in charge? The government or the Church? Americans would eventually answer that question with a constitutional wall between the two. Medieval Europe answered it with armies. The struggle produced one of the most famous scenes of the entire Middle Ages. In the winter of 1077, the excommunicated emperor stood as a penitent in the snow outside the castle of Canossa in Italy, begging the Pope to lift his sentence. European schoolchildren still learn that scene today. The most powerful man on the continent, humbled, freezing, waiting at a gate. But here is the part that matters for our story. In that same year, 1077, the Archbishop of Salzburg, a man named Gebhard, picked his side in the Great War. He chose the Pope, which made the Emperor his enemy, which meant Salzburg needed a fortress. Immediately, so Gebhard began building on the rock above the town, a castle to hold the valley, a castle to guard the church, a castle to announce, in white stone visible for miles, that the Archbishop of Salzburg answered to God and the Pope, and to no man wearing a crown. Building it was itself an act of defiance. Stone had to be cut and hauled up a cliff. Timber, water, grain, everything a garrison needs, had to climb that rock on human backs and mule trains. Gebhard was spending a fortune to make a political statement, and everyone from Rome to the imperial court understood exactly what the statement was. That castle is Hohensalzburg. It is the fortress in every photograph of this city, rising above the domes like a crown on the skyline. Gebhard paid dearly for his loyalty. Imperial forces drove him from his own city, and he spent years in exile while the war ground on. But the fortress stayed, and every archbishop after him kept adding to it. Higher walls, stronger towers, halls and storerooms and gun platforms, century after century, until it stood as one of the largest fully preserved castle complexes anywhere in Europe. One fact tells you how seriously these priests took their power. In nearly 1,000 years, no army ever took Hohensalzburg by storm, not the emperor's men, not rebel armies, nobody. Much later in this story, the fortress will open its gates exactly once, without a shot fired, and we will get to that strange surrender when the time comes. But taken by force, never. Armies marched into this valley, looked up at that rock, and made other plans. The war that built the fortress ground on long after Gebhard was gone, flaring between popes and emperors for decades more. And through all of it, the archbishops of Salzburg absorbed the lesson that would guide them for the next 7 centuries. Trust the rock, trust the salt, never assume that peace is permanent. Below the politics, life inside the walls settled into a rhythm that the church itself conducted. Bells divided the day. Monks crossed between the abbey and the hill that still carries their name. The Monchberg, the monks' mountain. Pilgrims came for relics. Merchants came for salt. And everyone from the tavern keeper to the toll clerk lived inside an economy that prayed and a church that traded. If you had told a visitor in the 1200s that this arrangement was unusual, he might have shrugged. If you had told him it would last, in one form or another, into the age of newspapers and steam engines, he would not have believed you. It very nearly did. By the 1100s, the transformation was complete. The Archbishop of Salzburg was no longer merely a rich religious leader. He was a prince of the Holy Roman Empire in his own right, ruling an independent territory with his own courts, his own soldiers, and his own mint stamping his own coins. Historians have a precise term for this rare creature, a prince-archbishop. Most of Europe kept the men who prayed separate from the men who governed. Salzburg fused them into one office, and the result was a small state with the wealth of a kingdom and the discipline of a church. The wealth mattered, because underneath all the politics, the engine never stopped. Down in the dark, below the sermons and the incense, miners were still cutting white gold out of the mountains, and every boatload that went down the river made the man on the rock a little richer. In the centuries ahead, the prince-archbishops would turn that salt into a fortune large enough to embarrass kings. One of them would sign his fortune with a turnip, and he may have been the richest of them all. Chapter 3. The Salt Princes. If you want to know what salt money could do, walk into Hohensalzburg Fortress and look up. There is a room in the state apartments called the Golden Hall, and its ceiling is studded with gilded ornaments shaped like stars, so that the whole room glows above you like a night sky cast in gold. A humble servant of the church did not build that room. A businessman with an army built it, and his name was Leonhard von Keutschach. Leonhard became Prince-Archbishop in 1495. 3 years after Columbus first crossed the Atlantic, while Spain was beginning to pull treasure out of a new world, Salzburg was perfecting the art of pulling treasure out of an old one, and Leonhard ran the place the way a modern tycoon runs a corporation. The foundation of the business was still salt, cut from the mountains, hauled to the river, loaded onto flatboats, shipped north toward the Danube and the hungry cities of Central Europe, with the Archbishop collecting at every single stage. He controlled the mines, he controlled the boats, He controlled the tolls, the staple rights, and the markets, and stacked on top of the salt came precious metal, because the high mountain valleys south of the city held gold, and mining there boomed in this era. Contemporary records indicate that the Gastein and Rauris valleys ranked among the most productive gold mining regions in the Europe of their day. Salt below, gold above, and one man's signature on all of it. Spare a thought for the people underneath that signature. The miners worked by lamplight in tunnels their great-grandfathers had cut, in a cold that never changed. Summer or winter, the boatmen ran the river in spring floods with cargoes worth more than their own houses. The wealth of this state was carried, quite literally, on the backs of people who would never see the Golden Hall, and who were reminded daily, by a bellowing organ on a cliff, exactly where the profits went, and what a signature it was. Leonhard spent his fortune like a man building for eternity. He expanded Hohensalzburg into essentially the fortress you see today, adding the great staterooms and reinforcing the towers, and he marked his work everywhere with the strangest emblem in the history of European power, a turnip. Legend has it that a relative once threw a turnip at young Leonhard to mock his prospects, and that he adopted the vegetable as his personal symbol so that no one would ever laugh at him again. True or not, the turnip is still there, carved in marble and painted on walls all over the fortress, more than 50 of them by the usual count, the brand of a man who wanted every visitor to know exactly who paid for all of this. He even installed a giant mechanical organ in one of the fortress towers, an instrument whose roar rolled down over the rooftops and earned the nickname the Salzburg Bull. Every day it bellowed over the city, a soundtrack of ownership. The citizens below heard who ruled them, whether they wanted to or not. Leonhard also solved a very practical problem in a way that still amazes engineers. Supplying a fortress on a cliff meant endless hauling, so around the year 1500, a freight hoist was cut straight up through the rock, a track and a sled drawn by rope, to pull cargo from the town to the castle above. Versions of that hoist have operated ever since, and the Reichszug, as it is called, is often described as one of the oldest funicular railways on Earth still in use. 500 years later, it still climbs the rock. The turnip archbishop built things to last. He also showed the city's own merchants exactly where they stood. When Salzburg's leading townsmen pressed for the kind of independence that free imperial cities enjoyed, Leonhard settled the question in a single evening. By the well-known account, he invited the mayor and council up to the fortress as his guests, arrested them on arrival, and released them only after they renounced the city's ambitions for good. Dinner at the archbishop's table, it turned out, could be a form of siege warfare. The burghers of Salzburg did not raise the subject again for a very long time. But you deserve the full ledger of this golden age, because it carried a dark side, and the darkness fell on people who had no fortress to protect them. In 1498, under Leonhard, the Jewish community of Salzburg was expelled from the territory. Families who had lived, worked, and buried their dead in this city were forced out of it. It was part of a brutal wave of expulsions rolling through the German lands in that era, and Salzburg joined the wave fully. The gilded ceiling and the expulsion order came from the same government, in the same generation. An honest history of a beautiful city has to hold both of those facts in the same hand. And the ordinary people of the mountains were not silent partners in the archbishop's empire either. They dug the salt, they hauled the timber, they paid the taxes and the tithes. By the 1520s, their patience was running out, and a new idea was climbing up the river valleys. printed on cheap paper and preached in village squares. Martin Luther's rebellion against the old church had set the German-speaking world on fire, and in these mountains it mixed with economic rage into something explosive. In 1525, the explosion reached Salzburg. Miners, peasants, and townspeople rose together in one of the great revolts of the German Peasants' War. And they did not just riot. They took the city. The prince-archbishop of the day, a proud and deeply unpopular cardinal named Matthaus Lang, a man who had climbed to the top of imperial politics and treated his subjects accordingly, fled up the hill and locked himself inside Hohensalzburg, while thousands of his own people surrounded it. For weeks, the fortress built to intimidate the population was besieged by the population. Rebels held the town below. The archbishop held the rock above. Between them, only stone and fury. It was the closest this city ever came to overthrowing its masters from within. It was not close enough. The fortress held, as the fortress always held. Relief forces arrived. The wider revolt across the empire was crushed, and the reprisals that followed were merciless here as everywhere. The rebellion failed. The cardinal came back down the hill, and the message carved into the skyline stood confirmed. You could hate the prince on the rock. You could even besiege him. You could not remove him. One more figure belongs to this turbulent age, because his grave is still one of the quiet wonders of the city. In 1541, a restless, famous, and endlessly controversial physician died in Salzburg. He called himself Paracelsus, and he had spent his life enraging the medical establishment of Europe, publicly burning the standard textbooks of his day, insisting that doctors should learn from miners, barbers, and healers who actually cured people, and laying stones that later centuries would build into fields like toxicology. By many accounts, he had sympathized openly with the common people during the uprisings of the 20s, which won him few friends in palaces. He died here with little money and was buried at the cemetery of St. Sebastian, where his grave still stands, and where, tradition says, the sick have come for centuries to ask for healing. The rebels this city could not remove by force. It sometimes simply outlived, and then quietly kept. Yet something had changed that no army could reverse. The new Protestant faith had taken root in the high valleys, quietly, in farmhouses and mining camps, beyond the easy reach of the city. The archbishops now ruled a proudly Catholic state in which thousands of subjects, in secret, no longer believed in the archbishop's church. For the next 2 centuries, that secret would lie beneath the glittering little state like a crack under a golden floor. Salzburg's rulers chose not to look down. They looked south instead, toward Italy, toward marble and music. The next great archbishop would tear down the medieval city almost entirely and raise the Baroque dream you see on postcards today. He had the ambition of a Roman emperor, a banker's fortune, and a secret family that broke every rule of his office. He would also die a prisoner, in his own fortress, staring down at his own city. Chapter 4. The Rome of the North. In 1587, a 28-year-old took control of Salzburg, and the medieval city's days were numbered. His name was Wolf Dietrich von Reichenau. He came from a powerful family. He had been educated in Rome, and he came home burning with a single conviction. Salzburg, in his eyes, was an embarrassment, a cramped Gothic town of narrow lanes and dark stone, when it could be magnificent. He had walked the streets of Rome while the great builders of the late Renaissance were transforming it, and he wanted that here. Marble squares, wide plazas, a cathedral to rival Italy. He wanted a Rome of the north, and he had the salt money to pay for it. He even brought in Vincenzo Scamozzi, one of the most celebrated Italian architects alive, to dream up plans on an enormous scale. Then, in 1598, fate handed him a match. The old Romanesque cathedral, which had stood for centuries, caught fire and was badly damaged. A cautious ruler would have repaired it. Wolf Dietrich ordered the ruins torn down completely, and contemporaries noted how little he mourned the loss. He did not stop at the church. To clear ground for his grand vision, he had the old cathedral cemetery cleared away as well, a decision that horrified the pious and, by the accounts that came down to us, scattered the bones of generations of Salzburg's dead. Citizens whispered that no good would come to a man who disturbed graves. This story is not kind to Wolf Dietrich. But first, the glory. He laid out new squares and straightened crooked streets. He began the Residenz, a palace fit for a secular king, in the heart of the old town, the Salzburg you walk through today. The city that looks so effortlessly harmonious in every photograph is not a medieval accident. It is largely the deliberate design of this one man and his successors, an Italian dream built at the foot of the Alps, square by square, on salt money and cleared graves, and behind the palace walls. Wolf Dietrich was breaking the most basic rule of his office. He was a prince of the Catholic Church, bound to celibacy. He was also, in everything but the paperwork, a married man. Her name was Salome Alt, the daughter of a prominent merchant family, and she lived openly as his companion. Together, records indicate they had around 15 children. He built her a palace of her own just beyond the old town walls, wrapped in gardens. Today that palace is called Mirabel, and if you are American, you have almost certainly seen those gardens on a screen, because Julie Andrews and 7 children would one day dance around its fountain singing Do-Re-Mi. Millions of visitors photograph the Mirabel Gardens every year. Very few of them realize they are standing inside a love gift from a prince of the church to the mother of his children. The Pope tolerated the arrangement, perhaps because Salzburg was too important to destabilize. The people of Salzburg simply lived with the open secret. What destroyed Wolf Dietrich was not love, it was salt and pride. His territory's wealth still depended on the salt trade, which made his giant neighbor Bavaria a permanent rival. Wolf Dietrich pushed prices and quarrels harder and harder, playing hardball against a duke who commanded several times his soldiers. In 1611, the dispute boiled over. Bavarian troops marched on Salzburg's salt towns. Resistance collapsed, and Wolf Dietrich fled his own capital. He was caught, forced from office, and handed over to the mercy of his own church. What happened next is one of the darkest ironies in this entire 1300-year story. The new archbishop, his own nephew, locked Wolf Dietrich inside Hohensalzburg. The great builder spent roughly the last 5 years of his life as a prisoner in the castle crowning his own city. Held, the surviving accounts suggest, in increasingly grim conditions, able to look down on the squares he had carved and the cathedral site he had cleared. He died up there in 1617, still a captive. The man who moved a cemetery ended as a ghost above his own creation. The whisper had come true. There is a final twist, and you can still visit it. Years earlier, while clearing the old cathedral cemetery, Wolf Dietrich had built a replacement, a graceful Italian-style burial ground at the Church of St. Sebastian, arcaded and calm, with a domed mausoleum for himself at its very centre. That is where they laid him. The man who scattered other people's bones rests today in the most elegant grave in Salzburg. A prisoner's body in a prince's tomb, and his cemetery kept collecting the city's stories. Paracelsus already lay near its gate. In time, the Mozart family would bury its own dead there too. If one quiet courtyard could hold this whole tale, it is that one. His successors finished the dream without him. His nephew Marcus Siticus brought in the Italian architect Santino Solari and pushed the new cathedral forward in earnest. Siticus also built himself a pleasure palace south of the city called Hellbrunn, famous for its trick fountains, hidden water jets designed to soak unsuspecting dinner guests while the archbishop laughed. Those fountains still work. 400 years later, they still soak tourists on cue, which makes them one of the oldest running practical jokes on the planet. Hellbrunn hides a more serious first as well. In its grounds stands a theatre cut into the living rock, and by long tradition, one of the earliest opera performances ever staged north of the Alps took place there in the early 1600s, when the art form itself was barely out of its cradle in Italy, a city falling in love with staged music. 4 generations before Mozart, some appointments with destiny are made very far in advance. Then came Paris Lodron, perhaps the wisest of them all. In 1628, he consecrated the completed cathedral, a gleaming Italian-style church with a bright marble front and a massive dome, one of the first great Baroque cathedrals north of the Alps. Bells rang for a week of festivities, and in the decades that followed, his successors kept polishing the scene. A fountain rose on the Residence Square that ranks among the grandest Baroque fountains outside Italy. Marble horses rearing out of the water in the middle of the Alps. Centuries later, a film crew would point a camera at that fountain, while a singing governess marched past it toward a new job. The city was assembling its most famous backdrop piece by piece, 3 centuries before anyone invented the camera. And Lodron did something even more impressive than building. He kept the war out. Because while Salzburg was raising marble, Central Europe was drowning. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, tore the German lands apart in one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Entire regions were depopulated, cities were sacked and burned, measured against the size of the population. Historians rank it among the deadliest wars the continent has ever suffered, and through all 3 decades of it, Paris Lodron armed his fortress, strengthened his walls, paid for a standing defence, founded a university in 1622, and steered his little church-state through the apocalypse without ever letting it through his gates. While Germany burned, Salzburg built. While armies starved, Salzburg sang. Refugees from the burning lands drifted toward the untouched city, bringing their skills and their stories of horror. Salzburg took in the skills, listened to the stories, and thanked its mountains. By the time the war ended, Salzburg stood nearly alone in Central Europe, intact, rich, gleaming, a Baroque jewel that had watched the end of the world from behind its mountains, and concluded, dangerously, that it was untouchable, but the crack under the golden floor was still there, out in the high valleys. Thousands of the archbishop's subjects were still secretly Protestant, still reading forbidden books, still praying the wrong prayers behind farmhouse doors. The marble city was about to commit the greatest crime in its history against its own people, and the date chosen for that crime was an insult all by itself. Chapter 5. The Expulsion. On the 31st of October, 1731, the prince-archbishop of Salzburg signed a document that would empty his mountains. His name was Leopold Anton von Firmian, and his signature sits on what history knows as the Emigration Edict. Look at the date again, October 31st, the anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the symbolic birthday of the Protestant Reformation. Firmian chose that exact day to order Protestants out of his territory. It was a message written in calendar form, and nobody in Europe missed it. Here is what had happened for 2 centuries. Ever since the peasant revolts of the 1520s, Protestant faith had survived in the high valleys of Salzburg's territory, hidden but never extinguished. Farm families passed forbidden Bibles from generation to generation and hollowed out hiding places for them in beams and floorboards. Outwardly, they attended Catholic Mass. At home, they kept Luther. Historians estimate that by the 1720s, tens of thousands of the archbishop's rural subjects were secretly Protestant, and in 1731, pressed by investigations and emboldened by their own numbers, many of them stopped hiding. Whole mountain communities openly declared their faith and petitioned for tolerance. The organizing went further than prayers. In the summer of 1731, by a story their descendants proudly retold, mountain men gathered by the thousands and confirmed their pact in the old Alpine way, around a table with salt on it. Whether every detail of that scene is history or memory polished into legend, the meaning was unmistakable. The archbishop's own miners were swearing loyalty to a forbidden faith on the very substance his palaces were built from. Firmian's answer was the edict. Under its terms, Protestants who owned no property were given only days, in some accounts barely more than a week, to leave the country. It was November. In the Alps, winter was closing the passes. Property owners received somewhat longer time to sell what they had, usually at ruinous prices to buyers who knew perfectly well that the sellers had no choice. Families were split apart. Researchers working through the records have documented cases from this era of children being kept behind to be raised Catholic while their parents were driven out. A detail that still stops historians cold. In total, scholars put the number of expelled Salzburg Protestants at roughly 20,000 people. Columns of farmers, miners, and craftsmen walked out of valleys their families had worked for centuries, carrying what they could. In the cold, a number like 20,000 hides the human scale. So slow down and picture it. A farm sold in a week for a fraction of its worth. A house key handed to a stranger. A child's bundle packed for a walk with no known end. In the coldest months of an alpine year, and Europe watched, because this became a media event of its age. Engravings of the trekking columns circulated across the continent. Protestant states printed pamphlets. Preachers thundered from pulpits in a dozen countries. For a moment, the Salzburg exiles were the most famous refugees in the Western world. Decades later, the story was still so alive that literary historians trace the seed of one of Goethe's most beloved verse tales. Hermann and Dorothea, back to an account of a Salzburg emigrant girl. Contemporary reports describe the exiles walking in long columns behind wagons, singing hymns as they went, and being met outside Protestant towns by crowds who came out with food, money, and open church doors. In Berlin, accounts from the period describe King Frederick William himself receiving arriving groups and joining in their hymns. Every mile of that road turned the Archbishop's private policy into a public spectacle, and every song made Salzburg's name a little darker in half the courts of Europe. Then something remarkable happened. Europe took them in, and one ruler saw them not as a burden but as a prize. King Frederick William I of Prussia issued an invitation, and the majority of the exiles, thousands upon thousands of them, made the long march across Germany to East Prussia, where the king settled them on underpopulated land. Prussian officials of the time recorded their arrival as a demographic victory, and economic historians have long described the expulsion as a self-inflicted wound that drained the archbishopric of skilled hands. With one signature, Salzburg had purified itself and impoverished itself. And what did Firmian do with the quiet he had bought? Among other things, he built, in the years after the expulsion, a lakeside palace rose just south of the old town, a graceful white residence called Leopoldskron, created for the archbishop and kept in his family. The name is worth noticing, because that palace will return in this story twice, in 2 different centuries, in ways Firmian could never have imagined. History has a long memory in Salzburg. It is not always kind to the men who built the palaces, but if you are watching this in the United States, follow the smaller group, because not all of the exiles stayed in Europe. In 1734, a party of Salzburg Protestants boarded ships for the brand new British colony of Georgia. They came with the support of King George II and the trustees of the colony, who wanted reliable, hard-working settlers for their experiment on the American frontier. The Salzburgers landed near Savannah and founded a settlement they named Ebenezer, a Bible word meaning stone of help. More ships followed, carrying more families. They built farms, a church, a school, and by several accounts one of the earliest significant orphanages in that part of colonial America. Their descendants are still there. The Jerusalem Lutheran Church at Ebenezer, raised by the Salzburger community in the 1760s, still stands in Effingham County, Georgia, and is often described as one of the oldest church buildings in continuous use in the state. The little colony's records survive too, kept by its devoted pastor Johann Martin Bolzius, whose journals are still mined by historians of colonial Georgia. The settlers experimented with silk, ran mills, and earned a reputation for order and stubborn industry, and the community never dissolved into forgetting. To this day, an association of Georgia Salzburger descendants gathers at Ebenezer to honor ancestors who crossed an ocean rather than give up a Bible. Let that connection land for a second. There are Americans alive right now, in Georgia and far beyond, whose family story begins with a signature on a desk in Salzburg in 1731. If your family tree runs back through the old Salzburger congregations of Effingham County, the trail ends at that desk. The same city that gave the world Mozart and the sound of music also gave colonial America some of its first religious refugees. The Alpine postcard and the refugee ship are the same story. This city keeps telling it. Back in the mountains, the valleys were quieter now, and poorer. The Baroque city still glittered. The fortress still stood. But something had gone out of the little church state, and it had perhaps 2 generations of splendor left. History rarely announces the final act. It certainly gave no sign on a cold January night in 1756, in a 3rd-floor apartment on a narrow shopping street, when the wife of a court musician gave birth to her 7th child. Only 2 of those 7 children would survive infancy. One of them was about to become the most famous name this city would ever produce. Chapter 6. The Miracle Child. The street is called Getreidegasse, and the house stands at number 9, tall and yellow, in the heart of the old town. The father, Leopold Mozart, played violin in the Archbishop's Court Orchestra. a serious, intelligent, fiercely ambitious man. In that same year, 1756, Leopold published a textbook on violin playing that became one of the most respected music manuals in all of Europe. He was, in other words, one of the finest music teachers alive, and fate had just delivered into his household one of the most gifted pupils in the history of music. The baby was baptized with a long string of names. The world would come to know him as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The stories from those first years survive in family letters and in accounts from people who knew the household, and even allowing for legend. They are astonishing. A 3-year-old picking out chords at the keyboard, a 5-year-old composing little pieces, which his proud father wrote down and dated, a small boy absorbing the violin, by some accounts, essentially by watching others play it. His older sister Nannel was a brilliant keyboard player in her own right, and Leopold understood exactly what he was raising under his roof. 2 prodigies, and one of them something more than a prodigy. So Leopold made the decision that would define all of their lives. Europe needed to see this, and the Mozart family went on the road. The journeys they made in the 1760s are hard to believe even now, in the age of aeroplanes. Munich, Vienna, where the little boy performed for the Empress, Maria Theresia herself, as the family letters tell it, charmed the entire imperial court. Then the grand tour, years long, through the German lands to Brussels, Paris, and London, playing for the French court and the British royal family. Along the way, curious scholars examined the child like a scientific specimen, setting him musical traps and tests. He passed everything. He wrote his first symphonies in London before he turned 10. In London, a scholar named Daines Barrington tested the boy so thoroughly, sight reading, improvising in different styles, composing on demand, that he later wrote the results up for the Royal Society, one of the world's leading scientific bodies, like a lab report on a natural wonder, and the road itself nearly took everything. Touring in that century meant weeks in freezing carriages and nights in strange inns, and the Mozart children came close to dying more than once. In Vienna, in 1767, smallpox caught them both, and for a time, by the family's own accounts, the boy lay blinded by the disease. Europe's little miracle survived on luck as much as genius, and a few years later, in Rome, came the most famous test of all. According to a well-documented account, the teenager heard a closely guarded choral work performed in the Sistine Chapel and afterward wrote the entire piece out from memory. The Vatican treated that music as its exclusive property. The boy carried it out of the building in his head. Understand what this meant for Salzburg, this small church state, this city of salt and marble, was suddenly producing the most talked-about child in Europe. And here is a thought to put his fame in scale. On any given day in modern America, more people hear Mozart's music in concert halls, in film scores, in commercials, in hospital nurseries, than could have heard it in his entire lifetime. That machine started here, on Getreidegasse, with a father, a carriage, and a small boy watching the Alps roll past the window. The archbishop of the day was proud of it all. Schrattenbach, an easy-going and generous ruler, granted Leopold leave to travel, kept paying at least part of his salary while the family toured, and treated the Mozarts as a glory project for the city. Young Wolfgang came home between journeys and wrote music for Salzburg's churches and Salzburg's aristocrats. If that arrangement had lasted, this chapter would end sweetly. In 1771, Schrattenbach died in 1772. Salzburg got a new prince-archbishop, a man named Hieronymus Colloredo, and the sweetness ended. History has treated Colloredo harshly, mostly because he made an enemy of the wrong genius. In fairness, he was in many ways a modern ruler, an Enlightenment reformer who trimmed waste, shortened church services, and tried to drag his little state into a new century. But he ran his court like a budget office, and he held firm views about musicians. A musician was staff. A musician wore livery, obeyed orders, produced music on schedule, and did not gallivant around Europe being adored. For Mozart, now in his 20s and fully aware of his own powers, this was suffocation, and we do not have to guess how he felt, because hundreds of his letters survive. One of the great correspondence collections of the 18th century, and in the ones he sent home, his contempt for his Salzburg position pours off the page. He complained about the pay. He mocked the town's provincial taste. He wrote openly about escape. At the archbishop's table, by his own description, he was seated with the servants. Below the valets, the composer of the century, ranked beneath the men who folded the archbishop's clothes, and reminded of it at every meal. He tried once to escape on his own terms. In 1777, he quit his post and went job hunting across Europe with his mother, to Munich, to Mannheim, finally to Paris. No court would take him on, and in Paris, in the summer of 1778, his mother fell ill in their rented rooms and died far from home. He came back to Salzburg defeated and grieving, into a better-paid post as court organist that he hated just the same. The next time he left, he intended it to be forever. The break came in 1781, and it happened not in Salzburg but in Vienna, where Colloredo and his household were staying. Mozart, summoned there as part of the staff, suddenly found himself in the most musical city in Europe. Noticed, invited, courted, he asked to be released from his service. What followed, in Mozart's own furious account to his father, was a shouting match in which the archbishop unloaded insults on him. Mozart pressed his resignation anyway, and at a final meeting, the archbishop's chief steward, Count Arco, ended the most famous employment relationship in music history by, again in Mozart's own telling, kicking him out of the room with a boot to the backside. That kick echoes through history because of what it set loose. Mozart stayed in Vienna as a free artist, and in the 10 years that followed, he poured out the Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, the Magic Flute, the great piano concertos, work after work that the world has never stopped performing since. He married, he struggled with money, he dazzled emperors, and he died in 1791, at just 35 years old, with the Requiem unfinished on his desk. He never lived in Salzburg again. His sister Nannel did. The other prodigy stayed behind, married into the provinces, returned to Salzburg as a widow, and spent her last years in the city giving piano lessons, going slowly blind, guarding her brother's letters. The world toured past her door to see where the genius was born. Almost no one asked about the girl who had once shared his stage. Now step back and look at the irony this whole city stands on. Walk through Salzburg today, and Mozart is everywhere. His face is on gold-wrapped chocolate balls in every shop window. A leading university of music carries his name. Statues, museums, concert cycle, an entire economy humming on his fame. The city earns from Mozart every single day of the year, and the man himself spent his adult life trying to get away from it, and largely succeeded. Salzburg's most profitable citizen is one it could not keep. In life, the relationship between this city and its genius was a failed marriage. Only in death did someone rewrite it as a love story. To be fair, Salzburg has long since admitted all of this, and it guards his memory with real devotion. The Yellow House on Getreidegasse is now among the most visited composer museums on earth. But in December of 1791, as Mozart was buried in Vienna, his home city had no idea what it had lost, or how badly it would someday need him. It also had no idea that it was about to die itself. The state of the prince-archbishops was 1100 years old. It had less than 15 years left. Chapter 7. The Fall. For 1100 years, through plague, fire, rebellion, and reformation, one thing in Salzburg never changed. A prince-archbishop ruled it. Then Napoleon Bonaparte happened to Europe, and 11 centuries ended in less than a generation. It began in December of 1800, when French revolutionary armies pushed into the region during the wars that were redrawing the entire continent. The reigning prince-archbishop was Hieronymus Colloredo, the same man who had lost Mozart 2 decades earlier. Now he lost everything else. As the French approached, Colloredo packed his valuables and fled his city. He never truly ruled it again, and the last Prince-Archbishop of Salzburg spent his final years away from Salzburg. There is a cold symmetry in that. The state that had exiled 20,000 of its own people for their faith ended with its own ruler in exile. And here is the payoff of a promise made much earlier in this story. Hohensalzburg Fortress, unconquered for 7 centuries. The rock that broke the peasants and outlasted the emperors, finally opened its gates, not to a siege, not to cannon fire, to paperwork and hopelessness. With the archbishop gone and the cause lost, the fortress was simply handed over to the French without a fight. The only army that ever got inside those walls walked in through an open door. Stone can defeat soldiers. It cannot defeat an era. The occupation itself was a lesson in what defeat costs. French and Bavarian troops moved through in waves, and armies of that age did not travel with supply budgets. They requisitioned grain, horses, wine, housing, cash contributions squeezed out of a treasury that was already bleeding. And the deeper wound was commercial. The salt trade, the golden thread running through this entire story, was fraying fast, because Bavaria and Austria had their own mines, their own routes, and no more reason to pay tolls to a dying principality. The business model of 1,000 years was expiring at the same moment as the state. The formal end came the way empires often end, with signatures. In 1803, under the great reorganization of the German lands driven by Napoleon, Salzburg was secularized. Church rule was abolished after more than 1,000 years. The territory was handed to a displaced Habsburg prince, Ferdinand of Tuscany, as compensation for lands he had lost in Italy. Read that sentence again slowly. After a millennium as an independent spiritual state, Salzburg had become a consolation prize, and the humiliation was only beginning, because now the city was passed from hand to hand like a coin. In 1805, the Treaty of Pressburg gave Salzburg to the Austrian Empire. In 1809, after Austria lost yet another war to Napoleon, Salzburg was handed to Bavaria, and the Bavarian government soon closed the venerable university that Paris Laudron had founded. Then, in 1815 and 1816, after Napoleon's final defeat, The Congress of Vienna shuffled the map one last time. Salzburg went back to Austria, permanently this time, though a slice of its old western lands stayed with Bavaria, where it remains to this day. 5 changes of master in 16 years. The proud little state had become a parcel. The treasures went too. During those chaotic years, the accumulated wealth of a millennium was carted away in waves. Precious objects, books, manuscripts, and artworks left for Paris, for Vienna, for Munich, some as war loot, some under legal cover, most never to return. The libraries and collections that generations of archbishops had assembled were scattered across Europe like the contents of an estate sale. A visitor could measure the fall with his own eyes. Where an archbishop's court had once employed musicians, cooks, guards, and grooms by the hundred, there were now clerks forwarding paperwork to other cities. The great residens stood mostly silent. Festivals shrank to memories. Even the bells, travellers noted, seemed to be ringing for a congregation that had left. If you want the human face of this collapse, consider a quiet man named Michael Haydn. He was the younger brother of the famous composer Joseph Haydn, and he had served as a leading musician of the Salzburg court for over 40 years. A friend of the Mozart family, a teacher whose students carried his craft across Europe. He stayed at his post while the world that paid for church music dissolved around him, and he died in Salzburg in 1806, in the middle of the wreckage, still writing sacred music for a court that was ceasing to exist. His tomb is in the cemetery of St. Peter, in the oldest heart of the city. One brother is buried amid the applause of Vienna. The other lies with the ruins of the world he served. Then came the quietest and cruelest phase, the phase nobody builds monuments to, irrelevance. Vienna ran Salzburg as a minor provincial possession, and for decades it was not even a provincial capital, just a district administered from the city of Linz. The court that had employed orchestras was gone. The nobles and church officials who had spent money in the town were gone. The population shrank. Buildings stood empty. Grass grew in squares where processions had once marched. In 1818, a terrible fire tore through a large part of the newer town across the river, and the cash-strapped authorities could barely respond. In the years that followed, parts of the old fortifications were even auctioned off for building material. Think about what that means. The city was selling its own walls. Visitors in those decades described a beautiful, half-deserted place, a Baroque masterpiece with the lights turned off. One British traveller after another wandered through and wrote variations of the same astonished sentence. How can somewhere this magnificent be this empty? One small household captures the era perfectly. In the 1820s, Mozart's widow, Constanze, came back and settled in this quiet Salzburg with her second husband, a Danish diplomat named Georg Nikolaus Nissen, who had devoted himself to writing one of the first great biographies of the composer. Picture the scene. In a fading provincial town, an elderly couple sorting through old letters at a desk, assembling the life story of a genius the town had once let walk away. While outside the window, the world was slowly beginning to understand just how great he had been. Nissen died before the book was finished. Constanze published it, stayed on, and grew old among the fading squares, the keeper of a flame the city did not yet know it needed. Salzburg in the early 1800s was something almost unheard of in history. A capital without a country, a treasure chest with the treasure removed. All it had left was its appearance. The domes, the fortress, the mountains doubled in the river. It turned out that appearance was an asset nobody had ever put on a balance sheet. Chapter 8. Rediscovery. Cities can die of many things. Fire, plague, war. Salzburg nearly died of something quieter, being forgotten, and what saved it was a change not in the city, but in the way Europe looked at mountains. For most of history, educated Europeans considered the Alps a horror. Travellers crossing the passes wrote about them as a wasteland of ice and danger, something to endure on the way to Italy, not something to admire. Then, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Romantic movement turned that feeling inside out. Poets and painters began preaching that wild nature was not ugly but sublime, that a storm over a peak could stir the soul more deeply than any palace. Suddenly, the very things that had made Salzburg's location a hardship, the cliffs, the peaks, the dramatic weather, became its treasure. Painters arrived and set up their easels on the riverbanks. Writers followed. The great naturalist Alexander von Humboldt is widely quoted as ranking the Salzburg region among the most beautiful landscapes on earth, and whether or not he said it in exactly those words, the sentiment ran through the travel literature of the age like a drumbeat. The half-empty Baroque city framed by mountains was rebranded by the century itself. Salzburg stopped being a failed capital and became a masterpiece. And in the middle of those hungry, forgotten years, this region quietly gave the world something it now cannot imagine being without. The story starts with a boy born in the city of Salzburg in 1792, in real poverty. His name was Joseph Moore. His mother was an unmarried seamstress. His father a soldier who had deserted and disappeared, and by a detail that biographers never fail to mention, the man who stood as the boy's godfather was the town's last executioner. A child could hardly start lower in that world, but the boy could sing. A choirmaster noticed, and the church gave him an education and made him a priest, assigned to poor alpine parishes. Moore wrote a small poem in 1816, 6 verses about a silent night and a holy night. 2 years later, on Christmas Eve of 1818, in the village church of Oberndorf, a few miles down the river from Salzburg, Moore asked his friend Franz Xaver Gruber, a schoolteacher and organist, to set the poem to music for 2 voices and a guitar. A famous legend says the church organ had broken down, and historians still debate whether that detail is fact or folklore. What is fact is what happened next. That night, the 2 men stood before a congregation of boatmen and salt labourers and sang Silent Night for the first time in history. The song left the valley in the packs of travelling folk singers, crossed into Germany, then across the Atlantic, translated into English in the 1850s in America, and on, into hundreds of languages. Today it may be the most widely sung piece of music on the planet, and Austria has had it formally recognized as part of its cultural heritage every December, when it is sung in churches and living rooms across America. A few notes of the Salzburg region travel with it. The American chapter of the song has its own charm. By the usual account, a family of alpine folk singers carried it across the ocean and performed it in New York City in 1839, in the days when Manhattan still had hitching posts, an event often cited as the carol's American premiere, which means Silent Night was already sung in America before Texas joined the Union. The Salzburg region had begun exporting Christmas itself, the son of a seamstress and a deserter, godson of an executioner, wrote the world's lullaby. Salzburg's greatest exports have a habit of coming from its humblest doors. The city fathers, meanwhile, were learning to sell the one asset the Napoleonic looters could not cart away, a dead composer. By the 1840s, Mozart's fame had grown into something like secular sainthood across Europe. His operas held the stages of every capital, and Salzburg, the city he had escaped, now proudly reclaimed him. Money was raised across Europe for a grand bronze statue, and in September of 1842, Mozart Square was inaugurated with speeches, choirs, and days of festivities. His two surviving sons attended the ceremonies. His widow Constanza had lived to see the project take shape, though she died in Salzburg just months before the unveiling, as if her watch had ended once the city finally took over the duty of remembering. Nobody at those ceremonies said the obvious thing out loud, that the honoured genius had spent his adult life avoiding this very town. It did not matter any more. The statue was not really about the past. It was an investment in the future. Salzburg had planted its flag as the Mozart city, and an industry began to grow around that bronze figure. Concertcycle, anniversaries, a music school founded in his name the year before the statue rose, which would grow into the world-famous Mozarteum. The failed marriage between city and composer was being rewritten, posthumously, into a romance. Then the rescue arrived in its final and most powerful form, the railway. In 1860, the Imperial Empress Elizabeth Railway connected Vienna to Salzburg, and the Emperor Franz Joseph himself was associated with its celebrated opening. Grasp what that meant in practice. The journey from Vienna, once days of jolting coach travel, became a matter of hours, and Salzburg sat directly on the line between Vienna and Munich, one of the main arteries of European travel. The trickle of painters and poets became a stream of middle-class tourists with guidebooks in their pockets. Grand hotels rose near the new station. Cafes multiplied along the river. Painters colonized the riverbank viewpoints so reliably that one spot is still called the Painter's Corner, and the city began to engineer itself for admiration. In 1892, a funicular railway was opened up the cliff to Hohensalzburg, so that tourists in skirts and waistcoats could ride to the fortress in minutes, cameras in hand, up a rock that soldiers had once dreaded. The unconquerable castle had become a viewing platform. Somewhere, the ghost of the turnip archbishop was presumably taking notes on ticket revenue. The city even acquired an imperial stamp of fashion when members of the Habsburg family took up residence in the area, the emperor's own brother among them, settling into a palace on the city's edge. Notice what had quietly happened to the economy, because it is the hinge of this whole story. For over 2,000 years, this valley had lived on salt. Now it lived on being looked at. The product was no longer inside the mountains. The product was the view of the mountains, the walk through the squares, the shiver of standing in the room where Mozart was born. Tourism is often dismissed as a shallow industry. For Salzburg it was a genuine resurrection. The population grew again. The empty buildings filled. The city that had been selling its own walls was now selling its own reflection. And business was very good. By 1900, Salzburg was a jewel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, prosperous, photographed, and secure under the long reign of Franz Joseph, an emperor who had ruled since 1848 and seemed as permanent as the fortress on the hill. Nothing about that world looked fragile. Almost nothing ever does. Right before it ends, in the summer of 1914, pistol shots in the city of Sarajevo killed the heir to the Austrian throne, and the empire Salzburg belonged to marched into the First World War. 4 years later, that empire did not exist. which left this postcard city facing a question nobody had ever asked it before. In a world of ruins, what exactly is Salzburg for? Chapter 9. The Festival. In November of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. The emperor was gone, the crown lands scattered into new nations, and what remained was a small, shocked republic called Austria. 6.5 million people, hungry, defeated, and unsure it deserved to exist. Vienna, built to govern 50 million, was a head without a body. In Salzburg, the tourists vanished. Inflation devoured savings, and food ran short enough that the elegant hotel dining rooms went quiet. People traded heirlooms for flour that winter. Respectable families learned the geography of soup kitchens. If you had stood on the river bridge in 1919 and predicted that this hungry town was about to become one of the cultural capitals of the earth, you would have been laughed at, gently, by people too tired to laugh hard. It was, on paper, the worst possible moment to launch an arts festival, which is exactly when two extraordinary men decided to launch one. The first was Max Reinhardt, arguably the most famous theatre director in the German-speaking world, a glovemaker's son from a Jewish family who had risen to stage spectacles for audiences of thousands in Berlin. In 1918, as the old world collapsed, he bought himself a home outside Salzburg, and not just any home. He bought Leopoldskron, the lakeside palace built by Archbishop Firmian, the man who had expelled the Protestants. The irony of that sale deserves a moment of silence. The palace of the great persecutor now belonged to a Jewish director who filled it with actors, writers, and musicians from across Europe. Reinhardt restored it room by room and made it one of the most storied private houses on the continent. History, in Salzburg, has a taste for returning to its own addresses. The second man was Hugo von Hofmannsthal, one of Austria's most celebrated writers, and around them gathered allies, including the composer Richard Strauss. Their idea, laid out in essays and manifestos that survive from those years, was audacious. If the Austrian Empire was dead as a political fact, its culture did not have to die with it. They would build a festival of theatre and music in Salzburg as an act of healing. Hofmannsthal wrote of the project in those years as a work of peace, art offered against the hatred the war had left behind. And they chose Salzburg deliberately, because no theatre built by human hands could compete with what the archbishops had already built. The squares, the churches, the fortress above, the whole city was the stage set, and this time that phrase was not a metaphor. They intended to perform on it. On the 22nd of August, 1920, on the Cathedral Square, in the open air, with the cathedral front as the backdrop, Reinhardt staged Hofmannsthal's play Jedermann, the old story of every man, a rich man confronted by death in the middle of his banquet. When the unseen voices called the hero's name, the calls echoed from the towers around the square, and audience accounts from those first performances describe the effect as electrifying, as if the city itself had joined the cast. A tradition was born that evening. The festival's early years ran on faith and empty pockets, with sets improvised and singers paid in hope. But the idea proved stronger than the inflation, and the founders kept converting the archbishop's leftovers into theatres. The most spectacular case was the old summer riding school, a 17th century arena for the court's horses, with spectator galleries carved directly into the cliff of the Monchberg. The festival turned it into one of the most dramatic performance spaces in the world, a stage whose back wall is the living rock of the mountain. Reinhardt even built an entire miniature city inside it for his legendary staging of Faust. It is called the Felsenreitschule, and an American film camera will find those stone arcades before this story ends. Jedermann has been performed on that same square nearly every summer since, and being cast as Everyman remains one of the great honours of German-language theatre. Within a few seasons, the festival added opera and concerts, and by the late 1920s, Salzburg in August was one of the places to be on earth. Stars conducted, royalty and film celebrities filled the hotels. The little city that had once exported salt was now exporting meaning. A festival that told a broken continent it could still be civilized. The city in those years even had its own resident literary celebrity, the writer Stefan Zweig, then one of the most translated authors alive, lived in a yellow house on the Kapuziner Berg, the wooded hill across the river from the old town, and half of literary Europe climbed his garden path. Zweig loved the view and hated the provincial gossip, collected manuscripts, wrote bestsellers, and watched, from his windows, the border country of Germany. He would later remember, in his memoirs, how close the gathering storm stood to his idyll. From his hill, on clear days, he was looking toward the mountain country where the century's catastrophe was renting a house, because just across the border, in Bavaria, a failed Austrian painter was building a political movement out of resentment and racial hatred. Adolf Hitler had been born in Braunau am Inn, an Austrian border town, and he knew this region intimately. Through the 1920s, he began renting, and later bought, a mountain home on a slope called the Obersalzberg, above the German town of Berchtesgaden, facing the same massif that fills Salzburg's southern horizon. We will climb that mountain properly in the next chapter, because its shadow is about to fall across everything. For now, hold one picture in view. Through the last golden summers of the festival, the man who would destroy this world could step onto a terrace and look out toward the mountains of the festival city. The 1930s turned that shadow into pressure. When Hitler took power in Germany in 1933, his government imposed what was called the 1,000-mark ban, a punitive fee designed to stop German citizens from travelling to Austria. The goal was open economic strangulation, and Salzburg, so close to the border and so dependent on German visitors, felt it immediately. In 1934, Austrian Nazis attempted a coup in which the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss was murdered in Vienna. Austria survived that year, barely, as a small authoritarian state squeezed between Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. And in that same grim year, after police searched his house in a weapons sweep that he took as an omen, Stefan Zweig packed his manuscripts and left his yellow house on the hill for England. He saw where the road was going. He simply saw it earlier than most. And yet, strangely, these menaced years became the festival's moral high point. Artists who refused to perform in Nazi Germany came to Salzburg instead. The most famous was the Italian conductor Arturo Toscanini, who had turned his back on the great German festival at Bayreuth and made Salzburg his summer stage in the mid-1930s. His presence turned the program into a statement. For a few summers, Salzburg in August was effectively the capital of the other German-speaking culture, the one the dictator hated, cosmopolitan, Jewish and Gentile together, international, free. Every performance was, in its way, an act of defiance staged half an hour from the German border. Everyone involved understood how fragile it was. In February of 1938, the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg was summoned across that border and up the mountain to Hitler's residence, where he was bullied for hours in a meeting that Austrian officials would describe with dread for the rest of their lives. Weeks later, on a March morning, German columns crossed the frontier. In Salzburg there was no battle. There were church bells rung in welcome, cheering crowds on the streets, and swastika banners unrolling down Baroque facades that had been built for archbishops. Within days, the men and women who had made the Festival of Peace were enemies of the state. The curtain was coming down. What played out over the next 7 years is the hardest chapter in this whole 1300-year story. Chapter 10. The Shadow Across the Border. Let us get the geography right, because this is where careless storytelling gets history wrong. Adolf Hitler never lived in Salzburg. His mountain residence, the Berghof, stood on the Obersalzberg, a slope above the German town of Berchtesgaden, on the Bavarian side of the border, roughly a half-hour drive from Salzburg's old town. But look at a map and you understand the obsession in this video's title. The Obersalzberg and Salzburg face each other across one narrow stretch of frontier. The dictator of Germany spent enormous parts of his rule not in Berlin, but on that mountain, in a house whose great picture window framed the Untersberg, the same massive peak that dominates Salzburg's southern skyline. Old legend holds that an emperor sleeps inside that mountain, waiting to return, a story attached over the centuries to Charlemagne or to Barbarossa, depending on who was telling it, and by multiple accounts from his circle. Hitler loved pointing the mountain out to visitors. He had been born an Austrian, in the border town of Braunau am Inn. This landscape was the scenery of his self-mythology. He did not need to live in the postcard. He built his terrace facing it, and in March of 1938, the postcard became his. German troops crossed the border, and Austria was annexed into the Reich in what history calls the Anschluss. In Salzburg, as in Vienna, there was no resistance. There were cheering crowds, and it is a documented and uncomfortable truth that many Austrians welcomed the annexation, a fact that post-war Austria took decades to face honestly. Within days, the machinery of dictatorship arrived. Political opponents were arrested. Jewish shops were marked and plundered. Teachers, officials, and judges who did not fit the new order were purged. It must also be said, because honesty cuts both ways, that not every Salzburger cheered. The city produced its own resistors, small circles who printed leaflets, passed information, and paid for it. Among them was a young Salzburg woman named Rosa Hoffmann, who distributed anti-war material for a banned underground group and was executed in Berlin in 1943. 23 years old. A street in her home city carries her name today. The crowds on the squares were real. So was she. Then, on the 30th of April, 1938, Salzburg staged one of the most shameful scenes in its entire history. On the Residenzplatz, the grand square that Wolf Dietrich had carved out for processions, a crowd gathered around a bonfire, and books went into the flames, works by Jewish authors, by political dissidents, by writers the regime hated, including Stefan Zweig, the city's own most famous resident of the previous decade, burned in front of the Archbishop's old palace. Historians note it as the only large public book burning staged in Austria under the Nazis. The city of festivals had hosted a festival of destruction. Today, a memorial on that square marks the spot, so that visitors photographing the great fountain might learn what else once lit up this square. The Jewish community of Salzburg was small, some 200 people remaining by the late 1930s, many having already fled the gathering menace. Now the rest were stripped of their property and their rights. In the November pogrom of 1938, the synagogue on Lassestrasse was ransacked. Families who could escape, escaped. Those who could not were eventually deported. And researchers who have traced the fates of Salzburg's Jews have documented the transports to the ghettos and camps of the East, from which most did not return. Small brass memorial plaques, set into the pavement outside their former homes, now carry their names. Walk the old town today and you can read them beneath your feet. Polished squares of memory in a city of marble. The festival, the great project of peace, was decapitated and repurposed. Max Reinhardt, its Jewish founding director, was already effectively in exile when the tanks arrived, and his beloved Leopoldskron was confiscated by the regime. He died in New York in 1943, never seeing his palace again. Stefan Zweig, hounded from country to country, died with his wife in exile in Brazil in 1942, despairing, as his farewell writings show, of the Europe he had loved. Toscanini never conducted here under the new order. Jedermann, the play of the Cathedral Square, was dropped from the programme, and the festival limped on through the war years as a propaganda showcase, entertaining soldiers and party officials. The thing itself continued. The soul of the thing was gone. Meanwhile, across the border, the Obersalzberg swelled into a second capital of the Reich. Chancellery buildings, guest houses, barracks, tunnels bored into the rock, and above it all the eagle's nest, the mountaintop pavilion built for the dictator's 50th birthday. Neville Chamberlain came to the Berghof in 1938 to negotiate over Czechoslovakia while the world held its breath. Ministers, generals, and foreign leaders made the pilgrimage up that mountain road for years. Decisions that killed millions were discussed in rooms with panoramic alpine views, and Salzburg played the role of glamorous antechamber. Klesheim Palace, just outside the city, once a Habsburg residence, was converted by the regime into a guest house for exactly such summits, and Hitler met Mussolini there repeatedly as the war turned against them. The city of the archbishops had become a lobby for dictators. For 5 years of war, Salzburg itself was spared. Then the bombers finally came north over the Alps. On the 16th of October, 1944, the first major American raid struck the city. The targets were the railway yards. The logic of strategic bombing. But bombs in 1944 were blunt instruments. Waves of raids in the months that followed killed hundreds of residents, flattened whole streets near the station, and tore into the old town itself. One image came to stand for all of it. The great dome of Salzburg Cathedral, the Baroque crown, consecrated in 1628, took a direct hit and collapsed into the church below. The house of the prince-archbishops stood open to the sky, snow falling where incense had risen for 3 centuries. The people, meanwhile, went underground in the most literal sense. Tunnels and galleries were driven into the Monchberg, the Monk's Mountain itself, and when the sirens sounded, thousands of Salzburgers filed into the rock beneath their own fortress. The mountain that had guarded the archbishops for 9 centuries spent the last year of the war sheltering their descendants from the sky. The end, when it came, carried one final mercy. In the first days of May, 1945, with American forces closing in and the Reich collapsing, the military commander in Salzburg faced down the fanatics who wanted a suicidal last stand in the ruins. He chose not to defend the city. On the 4th of May, 1945. American troops entered Salzburg without a fight. Days earlier, Allied bombers had already smashed the Obersalzberg complex across the border, and the man on the mountain was dead in Berlin. The shadow lifted, and the soldiers who lifted it walked into a damaged but living masterpiece, rubbed their eyes, and reached for their cameras. They were about to stay for 10 years. Chapter 11. The American Decade. The first thing to understand about occupied Austria is that the country was cut into 4 pieces, and Salzburg drew the American card. Vienna, like Berlin, was divided among the Allies. The Soviets held the east of the country, and the province of Salzburg became the heart of the United States occupation zone, with the American command for all of Austria headquartered in the city. For the next decade, this Baroque town on the Salzach was, in practical terms, an American town. The scale of it is hard to picture now. Tens of thousands of American soldiers and administrators rotated through the region. The United States forces requisitioned hotels and barracks, ran newspapers and radio programming, and found themselves stationed in some of the most scenic garrisons any army has ever enjoyed. Sprawling installations grew on the city's edge, complete with post exchanges, chapels, movie nights, and baseball diamonds mowed into Austrian meadows, so that a farm boy from Ohio could spend 1950 playing catch beneath the Alps. GIs photographed the fortress, learned to ski on the surrounding slopes, drank thin post-war coffee in the old cafes, and mailed home letters about a city that looked like a movie set with holes blown in it. Thousands of Austrian and American lives intertwined in those years, in workplaces, in friendships, and in marriages. There are American families today whose grandmother was a Salzburg girl who fell in love with a sergeant, and whose family albums begin with a wedding photograph taken beneath that fortress. But do not let the postcard fool you. The first years were desperate. The bombing had destroyed thousands of homes. Food was rationed and scarce. The winters of the late 1940s were brutal across Europe, and the black market flourished in every alley. And on top of a hungry city came one of the great refugee dramas of the century. The American zone around Salzburg became a gathering point for displaced persons, the survivors and the uprooted of the entire war. Liberated camp survivors, former forced labourers, ethnic Germans expelled from the East, Jewish refugees moving toward Palestine or America. Historians of the period count the displaced people who passed through the Salzburg region in the hundreds of thousands across those years. Barracks that had housed soldiers now housed families with nothing. Some of the camps around the city carried improvised names that tell you everything about the hopes inside them, including one Jewish displaced persons camp that its residents called New Palestine, aid workers, army chaplains, and relief organizations ran schools and clinics in the barracks. Marriages were celebrated, children were born, and clandestine guides moved groups of survivors south over the mountain passes toward Italian ports and the ships beyond. For many of them, Salzburg was the last European city they ever knew, the final platform before a ship carried them to a new life. Pause on that. For the second time in its history, after the Protestant expulsion of 1731, Salzburg stood at the centre of a great migration. Only this time, the city was the doorway out of catastrophe rather than the cause of it, and in the middle of hunger and rubble, the city made a declaration about its own soul. In the summer of 1945, mere months after the surrender, with American support, the Salzburg Festival opened again. The program was modest, the musicians were thin, and some of the audience wore uniforms. But the bells rang and the music played. The following summer, Jedermann returned to the cathedral square. Performed in front of a cathedral that still gaped open where the dome had been. It is difficult to imagine a more defiant image of continuity. Death called every man's name across the square, and behind the actors. The war damage answered. The Americans, for their part, did something in Austria that occupying armies rarely do. They invested. Through the Marshall Plan, American aid flowed into Austrian reconstruction, into railways, power plants, housing, and industry, and the western zones recovered at a pace the Soviet-held East could not match. In Salzburg, the scaffolding went up everywhere. Streets were cleared, the station district rebuilt, and the cathedral dome painstakingly reconstructed, stone by stone, until in 1959 the restored cathedral was reconsecrated, whole again. 15 years after the bomb came through it, the city took back its own story in the classroom too. In 1962, the university that Paris Lodron had founded in 1622, and that the Bavarians had shut down during the Napoleonic humiliations, was refounded at last, and it carries the old archbishop's name to this day. A century and a half after losing its scholars, Salzburg was a university city again. The American connection took root in the world of ideas too, and it happened at an address you already know. In 1947, a group of young Americans from Harvard founded a summer school for young Europeans, a place where the students of recent enemies could argue and study under one roof. The house they chose was Leopoldskron, the confiscated palace of Max Reinhardt, built by the archbishop who had expelled the Protestants. The Salzburg Seminar, as it became known, turned the house of the exiled festival founder into a meeting place for the continent's next generation, and it still operates today. Firmian's Pleasure Palace has now spent more of its life hosting dialogue than hosting archbishops. Even buildings, in this city, get redemption arcs. The decade of occupation ended not with a war but with a signature. On the 15th of May, 1955, in Vienna, the Austrian state treaty was signed, restoring Austria as a sovereign and neutral country, and by the autumn the occupying armies were gone. In Salzburg the American flags came down, the garrisons emptied, and for the first time since March of 1938, the city belonged entirely to itself. Here is the strange accounting of that American decade. The United States Army arrived as a conqueror, governed as an administrator, and left as something closer to a relative. Millions of Americans over the following decades would feel personally connected to this city, through a father who served here, a grandmother born here, a semester studied here, and then Hollywood arrived, and multiplied that connection by 100 million. Because among the true stories the Americans had encountered in Austria was the tale of a singing family from Salzburg who had refused the new order and ended up on a hillside in Vermont. Broadway had already noticed them. A film crew was coming, and the movie they were about to shoot in these streets and hills would do something no archbishop, no emperor, and no army ever managed. It would make Salzburg immortal. Chapter 12. The Hills Are Alive. The true story begins where this whole city began, on the Nonnberg, the Nuns' Mountain, at the convent that St. Rupert founded in the 690s. In the 1920s, a young novice was preparing there to become a nun. Her name was Maria Augusta Kuchera. She was an orphan, raised hard, trained as a teacher, and by her own later account she had arrived at the convent full of fire and short on discipline. The abbey worried about her health, and in 1926 the convent sent her out on a temporary assignment. She was to tutor a sick child in the household of a widowed naval hero, Baron Georg von Trapp. Georg von Trapp was a genuine celebrity of the vanished empire, a decorated submarine commander from the First World War, now a widower raising 7 children. And here is the first correction to the movie playing in your head. By the accounts of the family themselves, the real Georg was not a cold disciplinarian summoning children with a whistle. His own children later protested that portrayal publicly, describing a warm and gentle father. And Maria herself admitted the truth was more complicated than the script. The whistle made better cinema than the man. Maria came to tutor one child and ended up caring for all of them. In 1927, she and Georg married. In her memoir, she was strikingly honest about it, writing that on her wedding day she loved the children rather than the groom, and that love for her husband grew only later. Real life rarely arranges itself like a musical. Then came the twist Hollywood barely touches. The Trapps lost their fortune. In 1935, a small Austrian bank they had trusted with the family money failed in the economic misery of the era, and the household of servants and garden parties was suddenly poor. The family rented out rooms in their villa, and they leaned on the one asset that had cost nothing. They could sing. What had been family devotion around the piano turned professional. And in 1936, the Trapp family singers won a prize at a competition connected to the Salzburg Festival. Concert bookings across Europe followed. The movie invents a singing family discovered on the eve of catastrophe. The truth is better. They were a shipwrecked aristocratic family who sang their way back to solvency. Salzburg audiences of the 30s knew them not as movie characters, but as neighbours. A baron's family in traditional dress, singing madrigals and folk songs with unusual polish, led on stage by a young stepmother with unstoppable energy and a priest named Franz Wosner, the family's real musical director, whom the film would quietly erase. Catastrophe still came. After the Anschluss in March of 1938, by the family's accounts, the offers from the new regime began. A naval command dangled before Georg. Requests to perform for official occasions. The family has described Georg's refusal to fly the regime's flag on their villa, and each refusal made Austria more dangerous for them. So in the late summer of 1938, the Trapps left their home. And here is the correction this video owes you above all others. Because the movie's famous ending, beautiful as it is geographically upside down. The film shows the family hiking over the mountains to freedom in Switzerland. Now look at a real map. Salzburg sits on the German border. Climb over the mountains behind Salzburg and you descend, more or less, toward Berchtesgaden, into Bavaria, toward the Obersalzberg itself. The real family did something far less cinematic and far smarter. They walked to the station and took a train south over the Italian border, calmly, with their luggage. Because Georg held citizenship rights connected to his birthplace on the Adriatic coast, territory that had become Italian after the First World War. From Italy they travelled on, and eventually a ship carried them to the United States. America was not an instant fairy tale. They arrived with very little, learned English, and toured relentlessly as the Trapp family singers, crossing the country season after season, singing in church halls and concert rooms from New England to the Midwest. In time they found a hillside in Stowe, Vermont, that reminded them of the mountains they had lost, and put down roots. Georg died there in 1947. The family farm grew into the Trapp family lodge, which their descendants run to this day. and Maria herself lived on that Vermont hillside until her death in 1987. An American citizen with an Austrian heart, the family's American loyalty was not just paperwork. During the Second World War, by the family's accounts, 2 of the Trapp sons put on United States Army uniforms, one of them serving with the famous American mountain troops, and returned to Europe as soldiers of their new country. And when the war ended, Maria organized a relief effort from Vermont, gathering food and clothing by the ton and shipping it to hungry Austria, including the city that she had fled. The family the regime drove out spent the late 1940s feeding the people it left behind. In 1949, Maria published her memoir, The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, and the book set off a chain reaction. A pair of successful German-language films in the 1950s, then Broadway in 1959, when Rodgers and Hammerstein turned the story into The Sound of Music, the final musical the 2 men would ever write together. And then, in the summer of 1964, a Hollywood crew arrived in Salzburg itself, the film that director Robert Wise shot in and around this city, released in 1965 with Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer, became one of the most successful movies ever made. The winner of 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and for a period it was widely reported as the highest-grossing film in history. The locations were the city's own greatest hits, and by now you know the secret history of every one of them. The Mirabelle Gardens, where Do-Re-Mi ends in a dance around the fountain, where Wolf Dietrich's love gift to Salome Alt. The great fountain that Julie Andrews splashes on her way to her new job stands on the square where the books had burned 27 years earlier. The festival hall carved against the cliff, where the family sings its farewell concert, belongs to the festival Reinhardt built. The lakeside palace that lent its face and grounds to the von Trapp villa is Leopoldskron, built by the archbishop who expelled 20,000 Protestants, confiscated from a Jewish director, and reborn as an American seminar. The wedding was filmed in the great church at Mondsee in the lake country nearby. Even the gazebo, the little glass pavilion where 16 going on 17 is sung, has joined the city's permanent collection. Built for the production, it was later moved to the gardens of Hellbrunn, the trick fountain palace of Archbishop Marcus Sitticus, where visitors line up to photograph it today. A prop from a Hollywood musical now stands in the pleasure grounds of a 17th century prince of the church. And somehow, in Salzburg, that does not feel strange at all. And by a detail film historians love, the real Maria herself appears for an instant in the background of one Salzburg scene, an elderly woman crossing the frame of the movie about her own life. Then came the paradox, one of the strangest in modern tourism. The movie conquered America, Britain, and much of the world. It never conquered Austria. The German-dubbed release failed, and as tour guides and journalists here have noted for decades, most Austrians have simply never seen The Sound of Music. Salzburg receives, year after year, enormous numbers of visitors, many of them Americans, retracing the steps of a story their hosts barely know. The tour buses run daily. Visitors sing in the gardens. Locals smile and take it, because the fairy tale pays. But now you know what the tour buses do not always tell. The real story has no mountain escape and no whistle. It has a bankrupt war hero, a stubborn novice from the Nonnberg, a refusal that cost a family its homeland, and a hillside in Vermont. Strip away the songs, and the Trapps belong to the same long Salzburg story as the Protestants of 1731, people who walked away from everything rather than surrender what they believed. This city keeps producing that story. It just never expects the story to come back singing. Chapter 13. The Stage That Never Empties. So what is Salzburg now? This city of salt and priests, of genius and shadow and song. Walk it one last time, in the present day, and count the layers you can now see. Since the war, the city has lived a paradox. It is small, home to only about as many people as a mid-sized American suburb. Yet every year it hosts millions of visitors, and its name carries a weight completely out of proportion to its size. In 1996, the historic centre of Salzburg was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the world formally certifying what the Romantics had discovered by accident. The festival that Reinhardt and Hofmannsthal conjured out of the ruins of 1920 is now one of the most prestigious cultural events on earth, filling every summer with opera and drama and drawing performers and audiences from every continent. Jedermann still dies on the cathedral square, as he has in almost every summer for more than a century, and death still calls his name off the same towers. The numbers behind the elegance are industrial. A typical festival summer now packs roughly 200 performances into about 6 weeks, and organisers regularly report attendance in the hundreds of thousands, with tickets that sell out months ahead. What began as a defiant gesture in a starving town has become, by many measures, the most important classical music event in the world. The Mozart industry has become the city's bloodstream. His birthhouse on Getreidegasse ranks among the most visited sites in Austria. A leading music university carries his name. His face travels the world on gold and red chocolate balls. A birthday week of concerts marks every January. And this year the city quietly passed a round number. 270 years since a court musician's 7th child was born on that narrow street. The man who was kicked out of service with a boot now employs, indirectly, a very large share of his hometown. If there is an afterlife with a sense of humour, he knows. The old institutions have quietly closed their circles too. The university that Paris Lodron founded and Bavaria killed teaches thousands of students under Lodron's name. The Nonnberg convent, founded by Rupert's niece in the 690s, is still a working abbey, which means the institution where Maria von Trapp was a novice has now been in continuous operation for more than 13 centuries. The monastery of St. Peter still brews and bakes and prays where Rupert planted it. In most countries, these would be museum pieces. Here, they are simply neighbours, and the valley keeps adding layers, because that is what this valley does. In the lake country just outside Salzburg, a local entrepreneur built one of the most recognizable brands of the modern age, and the energy drink empire of Red Bull runs its global business from the region to this day. Its football club and arena stamped onto the city's modern edge, its logo carried by athletes on every continent. The salt that started everything is long gone as a serious industry, preserved instead as show mines where visitors put on overalls and slide down the old wooden miners' rails into the mountain, laughing their way down shafts that once fed empires. Even Christmas belongs partly to this region, as you now know, because Silent Night was born a few miles down the river, written by the executioner's godson, and every December it comes home to Oberndorf, where a memorial chapel stands on the spot of that first performance, and crowds gather each Christmas Eve to sing it where it was sung first. And high above the southern rooftops, the Untersberg still fills the horizon, the mountain where, the old legend says, an emperor sleeps and waits to save the empire. The empires came and went anyway. The city stopped waiting for anyone to save it a long time ago. There are honest shadows in the postcard too, and this story has earned the right to name them. The city wrestles, like Venice and Dubrovnik, with the weight of its own popularity, with August streets so full that residents root their lives around them, and with the question every beautiful place now faces, how to be seen by the world without being consumed by it. And Austria as a whole spent decades after 1945 slowly, painfully learning to tell the truth about 1938, about the cheering crowds and the burning books. The memorial on the Residenzplatz and the brass plaques in the pavement are relatively recent additions, signs of a city choosing, at last, to show visitors its scars along with its domes. Now come back with me one final time to where we began, in the old town at dawn, with the bells. You hear them differently now. That deep bell tolls from a cathedral consecrated in 1628, smashed open in 1944, and made whole again in 1959. Those cloister bells ring where Rupert planted a monastery in 696, and where a restless novice named Maria once hurried late to prayers. The fortress above them was begun in 1077 because a pope and an emperor went to war, was besieged by furious miners in 1525, was never once taken by force, and opened its gates only when its world had already ended. The elegant square below hosted processions, then a book burning, then everyman, summer after summer, calling a broken continent back to itself. Every great city has history. Salzburg has something stranger. Salzburg turned its history into its livelihood, completely, the way few places on earth ever have. The salt ran out, the archbishops fell, the empire dissolved, and each time this city survived by selling the only thing it had left, which was everything it had ever been. The stage set never went dark, it just changed the play. So when you come here, and if this story has done its work, someday you will. Do what the city has been quietly asking of visitors for 200 years. Stand on the riverbank at dawn, look up at the fortress, and understand that you are not looking at a postcard. You are looking at 1300 years of survival, wearing its scars under the paint, still holding the curtain up. The bells are still ringing, the stage is still set, and the story, as it always has in Salzburg, goes on